The night was thick with fog, the kind of silence that makes the hairs on your neck rise. Then, bang! A single gunshot cracked through the West Virginia hills, echoing like thunder trapped between mountains. That shot didn't just kill a man. It ignited the bloodiest family feud in American history. Imagine living in the 1880s deep in the Appalachian wilderness. The air smelled of wood smoke, whiskey, and gunpowder. Families weren't just neighbors, they were survival units, clans bound by loyalty. And in this brutal world, loyalty meant everything. Break it, and the land itself seemed to thirst for blood. Two families stood on opposite ridges of the Tug Fork Valley, the Hatfields of West Virginia and the McCoys of Kentucky. Both proud, both stubborn, both convinced the other was cursed. For decades, whispers had spread about betrayal, stolen land, forbidden love. But it was this night, this single shot, that turned whispers into war. Here's the twist. This wasn't random violence. No, it was revenge layered on revenge, stretching back to the Civil War. Devil Anse Hatfield, a man as feared as he was respected, once fought for the Confederacy. Randolph "Randall" McCoy, his bitter rival, fought for the Union. Brothers, cousins, neighbors, everyone had chosen sides and everyone had blood on their hands. The war ended, but the hatred didn't. It simmered, hidden, waiting for a spark. And the spark came in the form of a hog. Yes, a pig. In 1878, a dispute over a single animal spiraled into accusations, a trial, and humiliation. But don't be fooled, this wasn't about livestock. The pig was just an excuse, a symbol of pride and property in a world where reputation was life itself. By the time that gunshot echoed through the valley, the feud was no longer about pigs or politics or even land. It was about identity. To be a Hatfield meant despising the McCoys. To be a McCoy meant plotting the downfall of the Hatfields. Every smile concealed suspicion. Every shadow could be an ambush. Now here, where it gets terrifying. Locals whispered that the families weren't just cursed by hate, they were cursed by something darker, something ancient. Some claimed the Appalachian hills themselves demanded sacrifice, feeding on bloodshed like a beast that could never be satisfied. So I'll ask you this. If you were trapped between two clans sworn to destroy each other, which side would you choose? Or would you run before the smoke and screams found your doorstep? Comment below, because before this story is done, you'll realize there was no escape. Before the gunpowder smoke had even cleared from that first shot, the valley already knew who would be blamed. To understand why, you have to look deeper into the bloodlines themselves. The Hatfields and the McCoys weren't just families, they were dynasties. On the West Virginia side of the Tug Fork River, the Hatfields ruled with Devil Anse at their head. Picture him, tall, broad-shouldered, eyes that burned like coal fires. He had the swagger of a man who believed God himself had chosen him to lead. His family was wealthy compared to most mountain folk. Timber, land, and whiskey lined their pockets. They walked into church with polished boots while others carried mud. And with that wealth came pride. Across the river in Kentucky stood Randolph "Randall" McCoy. His family wasn't poor, but compared to the Hatfields, they looked beaten down by life itself. Their farm was smaller, their wealth thin. But what the McCoys lacked in riches, they made up for in numbers, grit, and a burning hatred that never seemed to die. And here's the dark irony. These two families weren't strangers. They were connected. Cousins married cousins, friends hunted together, even fought side by side during the Civil War. Their lives were tangled like the roots of an old oak tree, which made the betrayal cut even deeper. The biggest scandal, love across enemy lines. Picture a quiet night by the river, lantern light flickering on the water. Roseanna McCoy, young and sharp-eyed, slips away from her father's cabin to meet Johnse Hatfield, the handsome but reckless son of Devil Anse. Every step she takes feels like walking into fire. She knows her family would skin her alive if they discovered the truth, but the thrill of forbidden love was stronger than fear. But in Appalachia, nothing stayed secret for long. Their romance wasn't just risky, it was poison. To the McCoys, Roseanna's betrayal meant humiliation. To the Hatfields, it was leverage, a way to twist the knife even deeper. And when Roseanna ended up abandoned, carrying Johnse's child, her shame became the valley's favorite weapon. This is where the feud stopped being about politics or pigs. It became personal. It became about honor, reputation, and the one thing Appalachian families valued above all else, pride. And pride, when wounded, turns into rage. The sound of whispers spread like wildfire through the hollers. The smell of corn mash whiskey lingered heavy in the air as men sat around fires, plotting. Every glance across the Tug Fork River became a silent threat. And in those tense stares, something terrifying was clear. This wasn't just a feud. It was a war waiting to be born. So let me ask you, if your sister, daughter, or cousin had betrayed the family to your sworn enemy, would you forgive her, or would you sharpen the knives? Comment below, because what comes next proves that in the Appalachians, love was more dangerous than bullets. The Appalachian night had a way of carrying secrets. Whispers slipped through the hollers, carried by the wind, louder than any gunshot. And in 1878, those whispers turned into poison. The McCoys accused the Hatfields of theft, not of land, not of women, but of something far smaller, a hog. At first glance, it sounds ridiculous. A feud between dynasties sparked by a pig. But in the mountains, a hog was survival. It meant food through the winter, trade for medicine, even a man's reputation. To accuse a neighbor of theft wasn't just petty, it was declaring war on his honor. So when Randolph McCoy stood before the court, pointing his calloused finger at Floyd Hatfield, Devil Anse's cousin, the air turned thick with dread. The trial wasn't held in some marble courthouse. It was a rough-hewn log cabin, lit by flickering lanterns that made shadows dance across the walls. You could smell sweat, smoke, and fear mixing in that room. And when the verdict fell in favor of the Hatfields, thanks to a McCoy relative who shockingly testified for them, the McCoys left humiliated. That betrayal cut deeper than any blade. Randall McCoy's eyes, cold and hollow, told everyone in that room, this isn't over. But here, the terrifying twist, it wasn't really about the pig. That animal was just camouflage. The real wound was older, darker, dating back to the Civil War when a McCoy had been killed by a Hatfield in cold blood. The war was over, but the ghosts weren't. And now, they had a new excuse to rise from their graves. Every move from then on was soaked in paranoia. The crack of a branch at night, a Hatfield stalking through the woods, the creak of a cabin door, a McCoy readying his rifle. Families locked their doors, children were hushed, and the sound of distant dogs howling felt like an omen. The valley itself seemed to breathe hate. Locals swore they could feel it in the air, the tension, the weight of blood waiting to spill. Some even said the river between the two clans ran darker, as if it too was cursed by the feud. So here's the question that haunts us. If justice can be bought, if betrayal can come from your own kin, what does loyalty even mean? Which secret would destroy your family first, the enemy across the river, or the traitor sitting at your own table? The Hatfields and the McCoys didn't just wake up one day and decide to hate each other. Their feud had roots that stretched back into the blood-soaked mud of the Civil War. And if you've ever wondered how a family feud could spiral into America's deadliest clan war, the answer is this. The battlefield had already poisoned their blood. Picture it, 1860s Appalachia. The mountains echoed with cannon fire, the valleys ran red, and families were ripped apart not by outsiders, but by their own kin. Some Hatfields fought for the Confederacy. Some McCoys fought for the Union. Neighbors who once shared whiskey at the same table suddenly found themselves aiming rifles at each other across smoky battlefields. Among those soldiers was Anderson Devil Anse Hatfield. He was tall, iron-jawed, and cold-eyed, a man whose very presence could silence a room. He rode with the Confederate guerrilla unit, the Logan Wildcats, known for ambushes that struck like lightning in the night. His reputation wasn't just built on bravery, it was built on blood. People whispered that Anse didn't just fight wars, he fed on them. And then there was Ellison McCoy, brother of Randolph McCoy. Unlike many of his kin, Anse chose the Union side. When he returned home after the war, limping from an injury, the Appalachian hills no longer welcomed him. Shadows followed him. Voices whispered behind his back. And one cold January night in 1865, Anse was ambushed near a cave where he was hiding. He never walked out alive. The McCoys swore the killers were Devil Anse's men, led by the ruthless Jim Vance. But no one dared take the case to trial. No lawman in Kentucky or West Virginia wanted to pick a fight with the Hatfields. Anse's death wasn't just a murder. It was a message. Loyalty to the wrong side could cost you your life. And here, where the real paranoia took root, families didn't just lose sons in the war, they lost trust in each other. The smell of gunpowder never left their nostrils, the cries of the dying never left their dreams. When the war officially ended in 1865, peace never came to Tug Fork Valley. Instead, the hatred smoldered like coals buried under ash, waiting for the smallest breath of air to spark it back to flame. So when the hog dispute hit in 1878, it wasn't really about livestock. It was Civil War ghosts clawing their way back into the present. The Hatfields and McCoys weren't fighting over animals or land. They were still fighting the war, only now the battlefield had shrunk to their own backyards. And if you think that's chilling, wait until you hear how betrayal within their own bloodlines twisted that old hatred into something even deadlier. The year was 1878 and the valley was already a tinderbox. All it needed was one spark, and that spark came in the form of a hog. To outsiders it sounded laughable, two dynasties ready to kill each other over a pig. But in the mountains of Appalachia, a hog wasn't just an animal. It was survival. It was money. It was pride. Randolph McCoy accused Floyd Hatfield, a cousin of Devil Anse, of stealing one of his hogs. The case went to trial. Picture the scene. A rough-hewn log courthouse, lanterns flickering against the wooden beams, the air thick with sweat, smoke, and whiskey. Outside, both families gathered, rifles slung over shoulders, hands twitching toward triggers. Inside, every word felt like it weighed a man's life. The judge, a Hatfield, the star witness. A McCoy who shockingly testified for the Hatfields. When the verdict came down, Floyd Hatfield was innocent. The McCoys erupted in fury. To them, the trial wasn't justice. It was humiliation, betrayal, proof that the system itself bowed to the Hatfields' wealth and power. And here, where the blood really begins to spill. A few years later, tensions finally broke into open violence. In 1882, during a heated election day gathering, 3 of Randall McCoy's sons got into a brawl with Ellison Hatfield, brother of Devil Anse. Fists turned to knives, knives turned to guns. Ellison Hatfield was stabbed 26 times and shot. The McCoy boys didn't just attack, they mutilated him in broad daylight, surrounded by witnesses. Ellison clung to life for 2 agonizing days. The Hatfields refused to bury him until his body went cold, demanding justice. And when he finally died, Devil Anse made his move. The 3 McCoy brothers were captured, dragged to the banks of the Tug Fork River, and tied to pawpaw trees. There was no trial, no jury, only vengeance. As the cicadas screamed in the trees and the river churned below, Hatfield rifles cracked one after another. The McCoy brothers collapsed, their blood seeping into the soil. The mountains fell silent. Everyone knew what this meant. This wasn't about pigs anymore. It wasn't about the Civil War or politics or honor. This was blood for blood. And once that cycle began, there was no turning back. Neighbors whispered that the earth itself drank the blood that day, hungry for more. And the people of the valley, they braced themselves. Because if 3 men could die tied to trees without trial, anyone could be next. So here's the question. When justice is drowned in blood, do you fight harder, or do you run before your family becomes the next target? After the blood of the McCoy brothers soaked into the dirt beneath those pawpaw trees, the Tug Fork Valley changed forever. The cicadas fell silent, the air seemed heavier, and every creak of the forest echoed like a warning. The mountains weren't just quiet, they were listening. People whispered that the soil itself had been cursed, that once the first blood fell, the land demanded more. And in the days following the executions, the whispers spread faster than wildfire. This feud isn't finished. This is just the beginning. Randall McCoy stood broken, 3 of his sons gunned down without trial, humiliated in front of the whole valley. His eyes, once filled with a farmer's weariness, now burned with something darker: vengeance. To the McCoys, the message was clear: Hatfields could kill and walk away. To the Hatfields, the killings weren't murder, they were justice. But justice had no meaning anymore. The law was powerless here. Courts bowed to intimidation, sheriffs looked the other way, and politicians cared more about coal barons than blood-soaked mountain hollers, which meant the only law left was the rifle. At night, families bolted their doors, children were hushed, and every howl of a dog sent shivers down spines. Lantern light flickered against cabin walls like ghostly shadows. Men cleaned their rifles by the fire, the metallic scrape of steel on steel echoing like a funeral bell. And then came the rumors. Devil Anse won't stop until every McCoy is gone. Randall is planning revenge, something big. Neighbors who once traded cornmeal and hog fat began avoiding each other on the road, rifles clutched tight. Fear twisted into paranoia, paranoia into rage. The Appalachians had always been unforgiving. The storms, the hunger, the isolation. But now, the greatest threat wasn't the wilderness. It was the family across the river. Some locals even whispered of prophecy. They claimed the Hatfields and McCoys weren't just cursed by war or pride, they were cursed by blood itself. That each killing would summon another, each revenge would demand more, until the feud swallowed both families whole. By the end of 1882, the valley lived in a state of suspended terror. Every knock at the door felt like doom. Every rustle of leaves in the dark might be an ambush. The people of Appalachia weren't asking if another massacre was coming. They were asking when. So here's my question to you. If you knew a storm of blood was about to break, would you take up your rifle and stand your ground? Or would you flee before your name was carved into a gravestone? Comment now, because in the next chapter, forbidden love will fan these embers into an inferno. Inside the towering brick asylum on the outskirts of Lancaster, the whispers never stopped. At night, when the gas lamps flickered and shadows stretched long down the endless corridors, patients claimed they could hear voices, not just moans of the insane, but secrets. Horrors spoken in hushed tones through walls too thick to carry sound, and what they whispered would shake Lancaster to its core. Doctors insisted the voices were hallucinations. But then came the reports, patients describing the exact same visions, pale figures dragging limp bodies into the basement, women screaming through muzzled gags, and the scraping of chains in the dead of night. These weren't random delusions. They were testimonies. Yet every time one of these patients spoke out, their files were lost, their treatments intensified, and within days, they disappeared. The asylum itself became a machine of silence. Families who dared to question why their loved ones never returned from treatment were given the same cold response: complications. But the truth was far darker. Hidden behind bolted iron doors, Lancaster's forgotten citizens were subjected to experiments: electroshock currents strong enough to stop a heart, forced drownings disguised as hydrotherapy, and crude brain surgeries where the only anesthesia was a leather strap between the teeth. But here, the terrifying part, patients began carving their confessions into the walls. Shaky hands scrawled names, dates, and warnings in chalk, blood, and fingernail scratches. The most chilling message read, "We are not mad, they are." Visitors who saw these writings claimed the doctors scrubbed them clean by dawn, yet the carvings always returned the next night, as if the walls themselves refused to stay silent. Then came the discovery that turned whispers into screams. In a locked sub-basement behind a false wall, investigators found dozens of coffins stacked like cordwood, each filled not with bodies but with bones crushed, burned, and mixed together so no one could identify them. Were these failed experiments, or evidence of a cover-up too large to imagine? One thing was certain: The asylum was no hospital. It was a slaughterhouse disguised as salvation. And the cruelest twist, many of the patients weren't insane at all. They were widows who challenged property disputes, workers who knew too much about industrial accidents, and women whose only crime was disobedience. The asylum had become Lancaster's ultimate silencer. Once you entered, you didn't come back. Only your whispers did. But what if I told you those whispers never really stopped? Even today, locals swear that on stormy nights, if you stand outside the asylum's ruins, you can still hear the muffled cries echoing through broken windows. Some claim they're ghosts. Others believe it's the truth, refusing to stay buried. Lancaster's asylum wasn't haunted by madness. It was haunted by the truth. When the asylum's walls could no longer contain the screams, a new kind of darkness took root in Lancaster, one far more deliberate. It began with the widows. Alone, each of them was vulnerable. Together, they were unstoppable. And in a world where power was measured in land, inheritance, and silence, these women discovered a terrifying truth. They could rewrite the rules if they acted as one. First widow was Catherine Hargrove. Her husband's sudden death had been blamed on fever, though the town whispered poison. Instead of shrinking into despair, Catherine thrived. She inherited her husband's farm, his wealth, his influence, and when anyone questioned the speed of her recovery, she simply smiled. The second widow, Margaret Brill, followed suit after her wealthy industrialist husband collapsed at dinner. By the time the third and fourth widows emerged, Lancaster was beginning to sense a pattern. But it was too late. The pact was already sealed. The women met in shadow, gathering in abandoned barns and candle-lit parlors, where their whispered vows bound them tighter than blood. Their mission wasn't survival, it was conquest. Each had tasted the intoxicating power that came from being underestimated, and they realized something monstrous. A dead husband was more valuable than a living one. Together they formed a secret network. One would identify wealthy men with fragile health or dangerous habits. Another would supply the means, powders that dissolved in tea, tinctures that mimicked natural disease, or accidents arranged to look like fate. The last ensured the legal transfers of wealth were smooth and unquestioned. It was the perfect machine of quiet destruction. Husbands vanished. Wills were signed. Estates grew. And Lancaster's power shifted, not through ballots or battles, but through funerals. But here, the chilling twist. These women weren't united by grief. They were united by greed and perhaps something darker. Their meetings grew ritualistic. Candles, black veils, shared cups of bitter wine as they whispered the same words. For every death, a new beginning. To outsiders, they were grieving widows draped in mourning lace. But inside their pact, they were predators, masked in sorrow and bound by secrecy. And if you're wondering, did anyone suspect? Oh yes, priests whispered warnings from the pulpit. Neighbors claimed the widow's tears were too thin, their mourning too brief. But suspicion is powerless without proof. And proof, in Lancaster, had a way of disappearing, just like the men who dared to ask too many questions. The widow's pact didn't just haunt Lancaster, it controlled it. By the time the town realized, nearly every powerful estate had passed into their hands. The courthouse, the factories, even the banks. Slowly, silently, all of it was touched by their shadow. And the most terrifying question, were they the only widows in America who had discovered this secret, or just the first? It began on a storm-slicked night in 1884, when thunder cracked over the Black River Valley, and the rain beat against Lancaster's cobblestone streets like fists. Evangelene Brennan, the girl with eyes bright as church glass, walked out of her family's farmhouse and was never seen again. Her absence hit Lancaster like a funeral bell that would not stop tolling. Evangelene wasn't just any daughter, she was the pride of the Brennan clan, a bridge between two bloodlines torn apart by feuds. And yet, in a town already cursed by whispers of poisoned husbands and widowed power, her vanishing felt less like chance and more like fate cashing in its debt. At first the story was simple. Evangelene had gone to deliver a basket to a neighbor and never arrived, but quickly cracks formed. The basket was found overturned near the riverbank, the bread soggy, the apples rolling like scattered marbles. No footprints, no struggle, just silence as if she had been plucked out of the world in an instant. Then the rumors began. Some claimed they saw lanterns flickering in the woods that night, too many to be hunters, too quiet to be travelers. Others swore they heard a woman screaming, carried on the wind between lightning strikes. The widow's pact was the first name on everyone's lips. Had Evangelene uncovered their secret? Had she seen something she was never meant to see? Her mother refused to eat. Her father raged through the town with a shotgun demanding answers. But Lancaster only gave him whispers. Some said Evangelene had been taken to silence her. Others believed she had fled willingly, perhaps with a lover forbidden by the family feud. And a darker theory still circulated, that her own blood betrayed her. Here's the chilling detail. Weeks after she vanished, a bonnet was discovered near the old stone bridge, the same bonnet Evangelene was said to wear that night. But the ribbon was cut clean, as though with a blade. To this day, no one knows whether it was left as a message or a warning. Modern parallels are everywhere. Families who lose heirs mysteriously. Corporations silencing whistleblowers before secrets spread. Dynasties trading truth for survival. The disappearance of Evangelene wasn't just a tragedy, it was a weapon. Because her absence did more than leave an empty chair at the Brennan table, it reignited the blood feud that would turn Lancaster into a battlefield. And the haunting question that lingers more than a century later, was Evangelene a victim of love, of power, or of the widow's pact itself? When Evangelene vanished, Lancaster did not mourn quietly, it burned. Her disappearance struck the match, but the feud that followed became the wildfire. Families who had once exchanged crops at the market now exchanged bullets across fence lines. Neighbors locked their doors at dusk, children were pulled from schools, and churches thundered with sermons about sin and vengeance. Lancaster, once a fragile town of whispers, had become a battlefield of screams. The Brennans were the first to strike. On a cold October morning, when the mist clung low to the valley like a shroud, 3 Brennan men stormed the sawmill owned by a suspected McCoy ally. By nightfall, the mill was ash, the river choked with smoldering timber. The smell of charred pine carried for miles, a funeral pyre that declared war. But vengeance is never one-sided. Within days, the McCoys retaliated. A Brennan farmhouse was set ablaze, its windows exploding outward as flames devoured the night. Survivors swore they saw shadows fleeing into the woods, carrying torches that flickered like demon eyes. The town awoke to black smoke curling into the dawn sky, and suddenly, Lancaster wasn't asking if more blood would spill, only whose. And here's the cruel twist. Every act of vengeance blurred truth. Some believed Evangelene had been killed by the widow's pact, others were certain the McCoys had taken her, and still others whispered that the Brennans themselves had orchestrated her disappearance to justify their rage. No one knew, but in war, truth doesn't matter. Fear does. The violence spread like a fever. By winter, 4 barns, 2 mills, and half a dozen homes lay in ruins. Graves were dug faster than they could be marked, and with each burial, paranoia deepened. Every glance across a field became a threat. Every knock at the door after dark felt like death arriving. Sensory details haunt the accounts. The acrid sting of smoke in the lungs, the metallic tang of blood on snow, the sound of rifles cracking across frozen hills, echoing so violently it rattled the glass in church windows. Lancaster was no longer a town, it was a wound. Modern parallels are chilling. Think of gang wars spiraling from a single slight, dynasties destroying themselves over missing heirs, corporations collapsing when loyalty fractures into revenge. Lancaster's ashes of vengeance echo in every modern power struggle. When one spark is left unchecked, entire empires burn. And yet beneath the chaos lurked a darker question. If Evangelene's disappearance was only the beginning, who, or what, was pulling the strings, ensuring Lancaster's fury never died out? While Lancaster burned with open vengeance, a quieter, colder fire smoldered in the shadows, the widow's pact. Outwardly they played the grieving women, lace veils, soft sobs in church pews, candle-lit windows glowing like silent prayers. But behind locked doors, they performed something far more chilling. The rituals began at midnight when the town slept. The widows gathered in the abandoned parlor of Catherine Hargrove's estate, where the shutters were nailed shut and the air reeked of mold and extinguished smoke. They lit black candles whose flames danced against cracked wallpaper. Each woman wore mourning black, but not out of grief, out of allegiance. Their meetings weren't just about plotting new accidents. They were ceremonies of control. One ritual required each widow to bring an item from her late husband, a pocket watch, a wedding band, even a lock of hair. They would place the relics in the center of the table and pour bitter wine over them, whispering in unison, "From death we rise, from silence we rule." Wait, what? These weren't just secret meetings, they were psychological warfare. Each ritual hardened them, erased hesitation, and reminded them of the terrifying truth. They had killed once, and they could kill again. There are stories unproven but too persistent to ignore, that the widows sealed their pact with blood. Some say they pricked their fingers, letting drops fall into the wine before drinking it together. Others claim they cut ribbons of black silk and tied them around their wrists as symbols of eternal loyalty. No matter the version, the message was the same. Betrayal meant death. And then came the chanting. Neighbors claimed they sometimes heard voices in the dead of night, low, rhythmic, rising and falling like the hum of a distant storm. One farmer swore he saw shadows moving inside Catherine's house even when no lamps burned. Another insisted he heard laughter, sharp and cruel, carried on the wind. But here's the bone-chilling twist. Their rituals weren't just about the past, they were about the future. Each meeting ended with a vow. Another name, another target, another husband whose death would tighten their grip on Lancaster. And somehow, every time a name was whispered, fate delivered. The town began to feel cursed, as if the widows had bargained with something darker than greed. Crops failed near their estates. Crows gathered on their rooftops. Men who opposed them fell sick overnight. Coincidence or conspiracy? Modern dynasties echo this chilling pattern. Think of secret clubs, backroom deals, whispered oaths that decide who rises and who falls. The widow's pact wasn't just a rumor, it was Lancaster's silent government. And the most terrifying question, were the rituals just theatrics of power, or had these widows unlocked something far more supernatural than history dares to admit? If the widow's pact was bound by whispers before, it was the blood oath that chained them forever. One stormy night in 1885, as lightning split the sky and rain hammered the shutters like fists, the widows gathered in Catherine Hargrove's decaying parlor to perform their most terrifying ritual yet. The air was heavy with the sour smell of damp wood and candle smoke. A single table sat in the middle of the room, its surface scarred from years of use. Upon it lay a dagger, small, sharp, glinting in the flickering candlelight. They called it the blade of silence. Whoever held it, they said, was no longer a woman of grief but a weapon of power. The ceremony began with Margaret Brill. She stepped forward, her veil slipping back to reveal eyes dark with resolve. She pricked her palm with the dagger, the sound of skin tearing louder in the silence than thunder outside. Blood welled, bright and hot, dripping onto the table. She whispered, "For death I give blood, for power I keep silence." One by one the others followed. Catherine, Eleanor, Ruth, each slicing, each bleeding, each repeating the vow. The scent of iron filled the room, thick and metallic, clinging to their throats. Their voices overlapped in a chilling harmony until the oath became less a promise and more a curse that seemed to hang in the air itself. But here's the shocking twist. When the last widow cut her palm, she didn't let her blood drip on the table. Instead, she smeared it across the face of her husband's portrait that hung above the fireplace. The crimson streak glared in the candlelight like a scar. Gasps rippled through the room, but no one stopped her. Instead, the others followed, defiling the images of the dead they once called husbands. It wasn't just betrayal, it was erasure. These men no longer existed, except as fuel for the pack's hunger. From that night onward, the oath carried weight beyond fear. Any woman who betrayed the pact would not simply be cast out, she would be destroyed. Stories circulated of one widow who hesitated, her loyalty questioned. Days later, she was found lifeless at the bottom of a well, her body twisted as though dropped from the sky. The official report called it an accident. The town knew better. Modern dynasties operate with similar ruthlessness. Corporations silencing whistleblowers, political families burying scandals, secret fraternities punishing betrayal. The widow's pact was their prototype, perfecting the art of control through terror. And the most terrifying part, some believe that the blood oath wasn't just symbolic. They say the pact carried that dagger for years, ensuring that whenever silence was broken, blood would flow again. So ask yourself, if you lived in Lancaster in 1885, would you dare cross them? After the blood oath, Lancaster lived under a new kind of terror, an invisible shadow that stalked the town. It wasn't the dagger or the whispered rituals that struck the most fear. It was the mark, a silent warning carved into the very fabric of everyday life, reminding everyone that the widow's pact was watching. At first, it seemed like nothing more than coincidence. A chalk symbol scratched onto a barn door, a ribbon of black silk tied to a fence post, a single crow feather left on a windowsill, small, forgettable things. But soon, patterns emerged. Every mark appeared before disaster struck. A merchant who found a feather at his doorstep fell suddenly ill. A farmer who saw the chalk symbol on his barn lost his livestock to fire. And the family who woke to a ribbon tied to their gate. Within a week, their patriarch was dead, his tea poisoned at breakfast. The town whispered the stories in hushed tones. The pact leaves no letters, no threats, only marks, and when the mark comes, the grave follows. One chilling account describes a boy who stumbled across a widow's meeting place and saw the mark etched into the dirt, an interlocking circle and cross drawn with ash. Hours later, the boy was feverish. By morning, he was dead. No explanation, no cure, just silence. The fear was psychological as much as physical. Men grew paranoid, scanning their homes for hidden ribbons, checking their barns for chalk lines. Some even refused to drink anything they hadn't poured themselves. Lancaster lived in a state of constant dread, not of open war, but of the quiet, creeping certainty that death had been marked for them. And here's the twist. The mark wasn't just a warning. It was also a message to the widows themselves. Insiders claimed the symbols carried codes, who was targeted, how the deed would be done, and which widow would oversee it. It was an entire language of power written not in words, but in signs of doom. Modern parallels echo this chilling tactic. Gangs using graffiti tags to mark territory, corporations planting subtle leaks to destroy rivals, governments signaling enemies with covert symbols. The widow's pact was centuries ahead, turning Lancaster into a living chessboard, where every mark meant another piece was about to fall. Sensory memory haunts the legend, the scrape of chalk on wood, the flutter of a ribbon in the night wind, the silent weight of a feather drifting onto a doorstep. To Lancaster, these weren't random objects. They were death notices delivered in disguise. And the most terrifying question remains. How many marks went unseen, erased, or ignored until it was far too late? It happened on a night Lancaster would never forget, a night that felt less like history and more like a curse written in smoke. The townsfolk still call it the Night of Black Veils. The evening began with silence thick and unnatural. No dogs barked. No crickets sang. Even the church bell, usually rung for evening prayers, stayed eerily still. Then, just after midnight, the widows appeared. All of them, every single member of the pact. They marched through the center of Lancaster in absolute formation, dressed head to toe in black mourning gowns, veils pulled low over their faces. Each carried a single candle, the flames flickering like ghostly eyes in the darkness. Their footsteps echoed against the cobblestones, sharp and measured, as if rehearsed. Witnesses swore the sound alone made their blood run cold, heels striking the ground in unison like a funeral drumbeat. No words were spoken, not a whisper, not a prayer, not a sob. Just the slow, steady march of veiled women carrying their lights through a town gripped by terror. And then came the chilling twist. As the widows reached the town square, they stopped. Together, in perfect synchronicity, they lifted their candles and placed them in a circle on the ground. Then, one by one, they extinguished the flames, snuffing them out until only smoke curled into the night sky. The final candle hissed into darkness, leaving Lancaster in pitch black. Witnesses said the air smelled of burning wax and iron, and many swore they felt hands brush against them in the dark, though no one was there. When the widows lowered their veils, what lay beneath was worse than mystery. It was emptiness. Their faces were pale, expressionless, drained of humanity. One farmer swore their eyes glowed faintly in the moonlight, like embers buried in ash. Whether that was truth or terror, no one could ever agree. The message was unmistakable. The widows' pact didn't need words. They owned the night. They owned the silence. They owned the town. Modern echoes exist in every display of power meant to terrify. Gangs parading in enemy neighborhoods, dictators marching soldiers to crush dissent, corporations staging symbolic shows of dominance. The widows were masters of theater, wielding fear like a weapon sharper than any blade. Lancaster never recovered from that night. Shops closed early. Families locked themselves indoors, and every man who had once whispered of rebellion against the widows fell silent. Because on the night of Black Veils, the pact didn't just show themselves. They showed Lancaster what life looked like under their rule: darkness, silence, and fear. And the chilling question that still hangs over the town's legend: what happened to those who dared not bow their heads that night? Until now, the widow's pact had ruled Lancaster from the shadows, marks left in the night, whispers in the pews, veiled processions meant to terrify. But one day in 1886, they crossed a line that no one could ignore. They took death out of the shadows and dragged it into the town square. The victim was Thomas Yarrow, a mill foreman known for speaking too loudly about the widows. He had once declared in a tavern that he would rather burn Catherine Hargrove's house than bow to her. Days later, his barn burned instead, and soon after, Thomas himself vanished. For weeks, his family searched. Then one dawn, the pact returned him. Witnesses describe it with trembling voices. The widows arrived at sunrise, 12 of them, dressed in black as always, veils drawn low. But this time they did not march in silence. They dragged Thomas Yarrow through the mud, bound at the wrists, his shirt torn, his face pale and swollen from beatings. Behind him, a rope trailed like a serpent in the dirt. The air was thick with fog, damp and sour, muffling every sound except the widow's steady steps. Townsfolk gathered, helpless, clutching their children's hands as the pact led Thomas to the courthouse steps. No trial, no priest, no jury, only the pact, their veils, and a noose swaying in the morning mist. And then came the shocking twist. Thomas's last words weren't pleas for mercy. They were a scream. "They killed Evangelene, don't you see? They killed her," gasps rippled through the crowd. Evangelene's name had been forbidden, buried in silence. To hear it shouted at the gallows was like lightning splitting the sky. The widows didn't flinch. Catherine Hargrove herself tightened the rope. As the bell tolled, the trap was sprung, and Thomas's body swung above the crowd. His neck snapped with a crack so sharp it echoed down Main Street. The smell of wet hemp and fear hung in the air long after the body went still. Lancaster was no longer ruled by whispers. It was ruled by spectacle. The execution was a message carved into the town's soul: speak against the pact, and you will not vanish quietly. You will be destroyed publicly, your death a warning etched into memory. Modern parallels are chilling. Think of regimes broadcasting executions to silence opposition, corporations ruining whistleblowers in plain view, dynasties destroying traitors not in secret but in spectacle. Fear multiplies when it is witnessed. The pact knew this better than anyone. And here's the cliffhanger. 2 days after the execution, Thomas Yarrow's body vanished from the grave. No tracks, no shovel marks, just empty soil. Some whispered that the pact had claimed him a second time, dragging his soul into their rituals. Others believed his allies had stolen the corpse for revenge. But the question remains, was his final scream about Evangelene the truth, or just the desperate lie of a doomed man? After Thomas Yarrow's body mysteriously vanished, unease turned into terror. Families began sneaking to the cemetery at night, lanterns trembling in their hands, desperate to confirm whether their own dead still rested beneath the soil. What they found was worse than any nightmare: dozens of graves, freshly dug, standing open and hollow. Not disturbed, not robbed, hollow. The ground looked wrong, as if the coffins had sunk away into nothingness. Some claimed the dirt hadn't even been touched, yet the graves were simply empty. Yarrow wasn't the only one missing. Widows, workers, even children buried years earlier had disappeared from their resting places. By day, the cemetery was quiet, but at night, townsfolk swore they heard shovels scraping though no one was there. Others described faint hymns drifting across the headstones, sung in voices that didn't belong to the living. And when fog rolled over the fields, it twisted into shapes, tall, veiled figures standing between the tombstones before dissolving into mist. One family, the McClintocks, decided to exhume their daughter's grave after noticing strange markings carved into the headstone overnight. When they lifted the lid of the coffin, it wasn't empty, but what lay inside was worse. Instead of their daughter's remains, they found a bundle of twigs wrapped in her burial dress, bound with black ribbon. A symbol, perhaps, a replacement, a warning. Panic spread. Was the widow's pact stealing the dead for rituals? Or was something far more unholy happening, something that even the pact couldn't control? Rumors took root like weeds. Some said Catherine Hargrove believed the earth itself had grown tired of holding the weak and had begun returning them to the living. Others claimed the pact performed midnight rites, reanimating corpses as silent sentinels. And yet one theory silenced even the boldest whispers. What if the bodies weren't being stolen at all? What if they were leaving? Modern historians point to this as a classic tactic of control. When fear begins to dull, escalate. By turning the cemetery into a place of dread, the pact made sure no one would even bury their dead without first considering the widow's gaze. Control of death itself, that was the ultimate dominion. But the hollow graves carried another horror. In 1891, a storm washed out part of the cemetery hill. Coffins spilled into the creek bed below, and among them one was found not empty, but filled with bones that didn't match. Too many bones. The remains of multiple bodies crammed into one box, ribs splintered, skulls cracked. Who had placed them there? Why were they hidden beneath someone else's name? The townsfolk whispered of a ledger the widows kept, listing the accounted for dead, but that ledger was never found. And the chilling question remains. If so many bodies were missing, then where were they being taken? It was a stormy night when the discovery was made. A young boy, no older than 12, snuck into the abandoned rectory on the edge of town, dared by his friends to prove his courage. What he found wasn't courage. It was terror bound in leather. Hidden beneath the rotting floorboards lay a book, thick, heavy. Its cover made from some material that looked like cracked hide. When the boy touched it, he swore the leather felt warm, like skin. He didn't dare open it then, but by morning the whole town knew of his find. And in that frenzy, the ledger of the dead was revealed. The ledger wasn't a diary. It was a record, each page written in tight, precise handwriting, too clean, too deliberate. Names filled the margins, hundreds of them, beside each name dates. And beside those dates, strange symbols, spirals, crosses, veils, even sketches of flowers with missing petals. At first, townsfolk thought it was a list of the pact's husbands, the men who had died under suspicious circumstances, but it was far more disturbing. The ledger went back decades, years before the pact was even rumored to exist. Names of children dead from fever, miners crushed in the shafts, widows buried after childbirth. Every death in Lancaster had been catalogued. But the strangest part wasn't who was listed, it was who was. Entire families that had supposedly lived and died in Lancaster left no trace in the ledger. And worse, some names appeared twice, as if death had claimed them more than once. One page was different from the rest. Written in a darker ink, it bore a single chilling phrase, "Account settled." Underneath, 4 names had been scratched out so violently the paper tore. Locals swore those names belonged to people still alive at the time, people who mysteriously vanished weeks later. Speculation turned to horror. The ledger wasn't just a record of the dead. It was a balance sheet, a bookkeeping of souls, debts, and payments. Modern scholars believe the ledger was the pact's greatest weapon of psychological warfare. To hold a book that seemed to know the moment of your death, to see your name written before you had even fallen ill, it stripped people of hope. It made fate feel unchangeable. One chilling entry stood out. September 14, 1892, Thomas Yarrow, account settled, returned to soil. But everyone knew Yarrow's body had vanished. So if he hadn't returned to the soil, where had he gone? The ledger vanished not long after. Some claim the widows burned it in the churchyard, laughing as smoke curled toward the heavens. Others believe it was stolen, smuggled out of Lancaster by a terrified priest who swore it contained contracts no human hand should keep. But one entry remains burned into every retelling of the legend, a blank page at the end of the book, clean, untouched, as if waiting for more names. It began quietly, like a whisper carried on the wind. At first, a farmer's wife noticed a strange black smudge above her doorway. She thought it was soot, maybe from the lanterns. But the next morning it had changed, sharpened into a crude spiral. By the following week, dozens of households in Lancaster bore the same chilling sign. They called it the widow's mark. The mark appeared overnight. No one ever saw it being painted, carved, or burned. Sometimes it was a chalky smear on a doorframe. Other times, a dark bruise-like stain seeping through fabric or wood. One man swore he awoke to find the mark burned into the palm of his hand. Another claimed it bled through the hem of his wife's wedding dress, spreading like ink through lace. The town panicked. Who would be next? The mark never struck at random. Within days of its appearance, tragedy followed. A child drowned in a shallow stream. A miner was crushed under loose shale. A young mother was found lifeless in her bed, lips stained blue though no poison was found. Each victim's home or body had been branded first. Rumors spread that the widows no longer needed poison or knives. They had found something older, darker, an omen that condemned its target long before death arrived. The mark became a sentence, a signature, a chilling reminder that fate had been sealed. But here's the twist. Not all who bore the mark died. A handful survived, but their lives were never the same. One man left Lancaster altogether, vanishing into the hills. Another went mad, clawing at his own skin where the spiral had been etched. Survivors became living proof of the pact's power, not killers with blades, but killers of the mind. Psychologists today might call it mass hysteria. Fear made people see what wasn't there. A crooked nail in wood became a spiral. A spilled drop of tar became the widow's warning. And yet, too many coincidences lined up. Too many bodies followed too quickly. Was it hysteria, or was it a weaponized curse? The ledger of the dead and the widow's mark seemed tied, one a record, the other a prophecy. Some locals swore the widows carried ashes from their dead husbands, scattering them onto doorsteps by night. Others whispered of a ritual, animal blood mixed with coal dust, smeared by unseen hands. No explanation stuck, but the fear did. Even in modern West Virginia, some families tell their children, "If you see the spiral, don't sleep in that house." And in Kentucky, carved into the beams of an old collapsed barn, explorers once found a near-perfect spiral, black as coal, untouched by a century of decay. Coincidence, or proof the widow's mark still lingers? It was the dead of winter, 1889. Snow blanketed Lancaster, muffling the world in silence. But on one night silence shattered. A sound rose from the pines that bordered the town, a sound so unnatural, so inhuman, that those who lived through it swore it wasn't the wind at all. They called it the night of the howling pines. At first it began like any storm. A low moan sweeping through the branches, the kind of noise children pull their blankets tighter against. But then the moan turned into a shriek. Long, drawn-out wails that seemed to claw through the dark, rattling shutters, cracking glass. Dogs howled until their voices broke. Horses bucked in their stalls, eyes rolling white. Then came the screams. Not from animals, from people. Entire households woke at once, convinced they heard voices calling their names from the woods. Some swore they recognized the cries of their dead husbands, brothers, or sons. A widow named Eliza staggered into the street at midnight, weeping and clawing at her ears, insisting her husband's ghost was calling her to the trees. She wasn't the only one. Dozens of women stumbled outside, some barefoot in the snow, walking toward the pines as if summoned. The men tried to stop them. But here's the twist. When they laid hands on their wives, they claimed the women's skin burned like hot iron. And every attempt to hold them back was met with words no one could explain, ancient chants, whispered in unison, spilling from the women's mouths like rehearsed prayer. By morning, 3 people were gone. Tracks led into the pines but never came out. Their names later appeared in the ledger of the dead, written weeks before the night even happened. Psychologists today might explain it as collective hysteria, triggered by paranoia and grief. A community so steeped in fear that a gust of wind became a phantom's cry. But the details don't fit neatly. Why did people hear specific voices? Why did their names later match the ledger? Why did livestock die that same night, blood frozen at their nostrils as if suffocated by unseen hands? And here's the part that keeps the legend alive. Locals claim the howls return every 30 years, always in winter, always when the moon is half hidden. Some modern campers have recorded the sounds, high-pitched wails layered with whispers, as if hundreds of voices are trapped inside the wind itself. One viral TikTok in 2022 showed a hiker near Tug Fork Creek whispering, "It's not the wind, it's saying my name." The clip cut off before the sound ended. The account was deleted days later. Coincidence? Or has the night of the howling pines never truly ended? It was supposed to be the holiest night of the year. A winter communion when the weary people of Lancaster gathered in the candle-lit church to take bread and wine, to find peace in God's house while the storm of feud and paranoia raged outside. But on that night, the sanctuary itself became a tomb. The pews were packed, the smell of damp wool and pine resin thick in the air. The hymnals rose, voices trembling but hopeful, as Reverend Calloway lifted the chalice high. He promised renewal, forgiveness, a cleansing of fear. Families bowed their heads, clutching children close. For a brief hour, it seemed as if Lancaster might heal. Then the coughing began. At first it was just one man hacking into his sleeve, then another, and another. Within minutes, a chorus of choking filled the church. People collapsed in the aisles, clutching their throats, eyes rolling back. Children screamed as their mothers fell limp beside them. The wine, the sacred blood of Christ, had turned into poison. But here's the twist. Not everyone drank. Some claimed they noticed a strange bitterness in the air before the chalice reached their lips. Others said they saw something glint at the bottom of the cup, a shimmer like black oil. Those who abstained survived. Those who drank did not. By dawn, 7 parishioners were dead. Their lips stained a sickly violet. Their names would later appear in the ledger of the dead, written days before the service. Panic spread through the town like wildfire. Had the widows poisoned the wine, or was the reverend himself complicit? Some whispered that the pact had infiltrated the church, twisting holy ritual into execution. Others swore it was divine punishment, God's wrath for a community that had tolerated sin and silence for too long. The psychological toll was devastating. Church was no longer a refuge, it was a trap. People began to pray in their barns, in fields, in secret. Doors to the chapel rotted from neglect, hymnals gathered dust. Lancaster became a town without faith, its people abandoned by both man and God. Even today, historians argue whether the event was murder or myth. Poisoning a communal chalice seems nearly impossible to carry out unnoticed. And yet, forensic analysis of preserved chalice fragments in a local museum revealed trace amounts of belladonna, a poison widely available in the 19th century, often used by women in tiny doses as beauty drops. Too much, however, brought death. The story lingers like a curse. In some Appalachian churches, older congregants still whisper before communion, "Check the wine," a reminder that once in Lancaster, the line between salvation and damnation was as thin as a sip. Every feud has its traitor, and in the Hatfield-McCoy War, betrayal didn't come from strangers or hired guns, it came from blood. By the late 1880s, the feud had scorched everything in its path. Farms burned, children orphaned, men buried in shallow graves by the Tug Fork. Loyalty was currency, and suspicion was poison. Both clans guarded their secrets with the ferocity of wolves, but no fortress is safe when the enemy sleeps under your roof. The story begins with a Hatfield cousin, young, charming, restless. His name drifts through history like smoke, Elias. Some say he was barely 20 when he crossed the line. Tired of Devil Anse Hatfield's iron grip, Elias sought freedom, wealth, and power, and he found it not in loyalty but in betrayal. Whispers say he met secretly with a McCoy under the cover of darkness, pine needles crunching beneath his boots as he carried maps of Hatfield hideouts. In exchange, he demanded gold, whiskey, and the promise of land. But the McCoys didn't trust him fully. To prove his worth, Elias had to offer something more, something unforgettable. He delivered his own kin. On a frozen morning, 3 Hatfield boys, barely older than teenagers, were ambushed on a hunting trail, shot down before they could draw their rifles. Their bodies left in the snow, throats cut as if to mark the betrayal in blood. The McCoys claimed victory. The Hatfields mourned vengeance, and all fingers pointed inward. When Devil Anse discovered the treachery, his fury shook the mountains. He interrogated his kin one by one, searching for cracks in loyalty. Suspicion spread like wildfire. No cousin, no brother, no uncle was safe from accusation. Families barred their doors at night, fearful not of the enemy across the river, but of the cousins sharing their table. Here's the twist. Some historians argue Elias never existed, that he was a phantom invention, a scapegoat to explain the sudden ambush. But oral accounts from Appalachian descendants insist otherwise. They say a Hatfield was hanged by his own kin, strung up in the pines without trial, his body left swinging as a warning. A traitor's fate. The psychological wound was deeper than any bullet. Betrayal in blood meant no one could be trusted, not even family. And once that seed was planted, paranoia ruled. Every cough at the dinner table, every whispered word behind closed doors could be treason. Modern parallels. Think of mafia dynasties or political families, where betrayal from the inside has toppled empires. The Hatfield-McCoy feud was no different. One traitor didn't just spill blood. He poured gasoline on a fire already raging out of control. And the mountains never forgot. Even today, in Pike County, locals whisper that if you walk deep enough into the hollows, you might hear the creak of a rope swaying in the pines. The ghost of the Hatfield who sold his own bloodline. When the feud's violence consumed the men, another rumor began to fester in the shadows, that the widows, left behind with their grief, had formed a court of their own. Not a court of law, but something darker, older. They called it the widow's court. It wasn't held in a courthouse or even in daylight. Locals whispered that once a month, when the moon was thin and sickle-shaped, the widows gathered deep in the pine thickets. Lanterns swung from low branches, their flames flickering like eyes. The air reeked of pitch and wet earth, and at the center of the clearing a crude bench was carved from stone. This, they said, was the widow's seat, the throne from which judgments were pronounced. Who stood trial, not outsiders, not strangers, but their own kin. Men suspected of cowardice, of betrayal, of speaking too kindly of the enemy. Even women accused of defying the pact found themselves dragged before the court. The accused were forced to kneel in the mud, lit by nothing but lantern fire and the pale shimmer of blades in widows' hands. Witnesses, if they can be believed, spoke of voices chanting in unison, low and guttural, as if reciting scripture twisted inside out. The accused were given no chance to speak, no chance to plead. Instead, the widow's seat decided. One tilt of a hand meant banishment. 2 tilts meant death. The punishments were swift. Some were left bound to trees, their bodies discovered days later by hunters. Others were never seen again. Locals claimed the widows buried their victims beneath the pines, roots curling over them like fingers, swallowing them whole. Here's the chilling twist. One Hatfield boy stumbled upon the court by accident while tracking a deer. He swore he saw his own aunt presiding on the widow's seat. When she caught sight of him, she didn't cry out. She simply raised a finger to her lips, and he fled in terror, never speaking of it again until his dying day. Psychologists today interpret the widow's court as a projection of control. These women, powerless in law and politics, created their own authority, a place where their voices, silenced by men, became law. But to the townsfolk of the 1880s, it was no feminist rebellion. It was witchcraft made flesh. And perhaps the most unsettling detail, explorers in the 1950s claimed to find the remnants of that clearing. A mossy stone, shaped almost like a seat, sat in the middle of blackened earth. Locals warned them not to touch it. One man laughed, sat down, and within months he was dead from a freak accident in the mines. Coincidence? Or was the widow's court still passing judgment long after the feud had ended? Every feud births martyrs, but some names slip into legend not because they died, because they vanished. Mary Hatfield was one of them. She was 17, a girl with hair the color of coal dust and a laugh people swore could cut through even the darkest Appalachian nights. Unlike her cousins, who carried rifles like second skin, Mary was said to carry books. She dreamed of leaving the Tug Fork Valley, of escaping the blood-soaked feud that chained her family to endless violence. But fate never let her leave. Instead, it erased her. One January evening in 1890, Mary stepped out of her cabin to fetch water from the well. She never returned. The bucket was found half filled, rocking gently as though it had been set down in haste. Snow covered the ground, yet there were no footprints leading away. Just one, a faint spiral, blackened into the ice. The town erupted. The McCoys were the first suspects. Some Hatfields claimed they had seen McCoy riders skulking near the ridge that week. Others swore the widows had marked her, that Mary had refused to join their pact and was silenced for betrayal. But here's the twist. Mary wasn't just a girl. She was rumored to be carrying secrets. Whispers claimed she had discovered something about the ledger of the dead, that she'd found her own name scratched faintly on its final blank page. Worse still. Some said she was secretly writing letters to a McCoy boy, an affair that, if exposed, could shatter both clans from within. For weeks, search parties scoured the valley. Dogs picked up her scent near the pines but lost it by the Tug Fork River. Some said they saw her white shawl caught on a branch downstream, but the current carried it away before it could be retrieved. Psychologists today frame her story as the perfect symbol of the feud's paranoia. Whether kidnapped, murdered, or vanished by her own will, Mary became a mirror for every fear. Betrayal, forbidden love, supernatural curses. Each clan twisted her disappearance into proof of the other's guilt. But the strangest part, decades later, a diary surfaced in an attic in Pike County. Inside were poems signed M.H., poems about drowning, about blood in the snow, about being called into the trees. Handwriting experts believe it matched Mary's. How did her words survive when she did not? To this day, locals whisper that on cold January nights, if you stand by the Hatfield well, you might hear water sloshing and a girl's voice, soft, pleading, unfinished. Mary Hatfield didn't just vanish. She became Lancaster's eternal question mark. The feud had already claimed dozens of lives, but nothing compared to the night the mountains bled red. Locals still whisper it as the Blood Moon Massacre, the point where vengeance swallowed reason whole. It was January 1888. The Tug Fork Valley lay under snow, brittle and silent, but overhead loomed a sky like fire. A blood-red moon rose, staining the river crimson. The Hatfields took it as a sign. Tonight was judgment. Led by Devil Anse himself, a band of armed men stormed into the McCoy settlement. Their target, Randolph McCoy, the patriarch who refused to bow, who carried his family's honor like a crown of thorns. The McCoys had been celebrating New Year's only hours before. Children were asleep in their beds, women tending fires. Then came the sound of gunshots, torches smashing through windows, and the shrill screams of horses breaking free. Panic ripped through the cabins as Hatfields fired into the dark, setting homes ablaze. Randolph barely escaped into the freezing woods, bleeding from a wound to his shoulder. But not everyone was so lucky. His son Calvin was gunned down trying to shield his siblings. His daughter Alifair ran into the snow with nothing but a blanket wrapped around her shoulders. She was cut down before she reached the trees. The fire swallowed the cabin, turning the McCoy homestead into a pyre. Witnesses later said the Hatfields moved like phantoms, their faces painted with ash to blur into the smoke. Some swore they carried not just rifles, but knives engraved with strange symbols, the same markings rumored to match the ledger of the dead. The psychology of that night is chilling. It wasn't just murder, it was ritual. Researchers argue the massacre was designed not only to break the McCoys physically, but spiritually. By burning Randolph's home under the blood moon, the Hatfields staged a symbolic erasure of his bloodline. Survivors of the feud described the terror as worse than death, the feeling that fate itself had been sealed. But here's the dark twist. Despite the slaughter, the massacre didn't end the feud. It fanned it. News spread through Appalachia like wildfire. Newspapers printed the blood moon as though it were a cosmic omen. Politicians demanded arrests. Posses hunted Hatfield men through the forests. And in the McCoys, grief, vengeance hardened into obsession. The Tug Fork Valley was no longer just a battleground. It had become a graveyard lit by the glow of a cursed moon. Even today, locals claim that whenever a blood moon rises over Kentucky, shadows move at the tree line, and the sound of crackling fire echoes through the hollers, as if the massacre is doomed to replay forever. The feud had crossed a line that night. What began as revenge had transformed into legend, and legend into nightmare. The Blood Moon Massacre had left the Tug Fork Valley soaked in terror, and for the first time, the outside world could no longer look away. Newspapers from New York to Chicago carried lurid headlines: Family War in the Mountains, Blood Feud of Appalachia. Politicians were pressured, governors exchanged angry letters, and suddenly this forgotten corner of Kentucky and West Virginia became the center of America's attention. The feud was no longer just local, it was national. Lawmen finally moved in with overwhelming force. Posses, backed by state militia, stormed through the hills to round up the Hatfield clan. Some fled into the wilderness, vanishing like smoke. Others were dragged in chains through jeering crowds. When Cap Hatfield was captured, onlookers threw stones, screaming curses as if he were the devil himself. But the biggest prize of all was Valentine Uncle Wal Hatfield, arrested as the mastermind behind the massacre. He would stand trial in Kentucky for murder. From the moment the trial began in 1889, it was unlike anything Appalachia had ever seen. The courthouse was packed wall to wall, a theater of vengeance. Armed guards lined the walls, fearing that one side or the other might try to finish the fight right there in the courtroom. McCoy supporters filled the benches, glaring at the defendants as if their very presence was an insult to justice. Reporters jotted notes furiously, feeding the nation's hunger for every bloody detail. But this was no ordinary trial. It was psychological warfare. The Hatfields, lawyers argued the court had no jurisdiction, since the crimes had spilled across state lines. They painted their clients as victims of political scapegoating, claiming the McCoys had manipulated the system. On the other side, the prosecution leaned into raw emotion, parading the grief-stricken McCoy survivors to the witness stand. Randolph McCoy himself, haggard and broken, raised his bandaged arm and thundered, "These men burned my home, butchered my children. If this isn't justice, then there is no law in America." The crowd erupted in tears and shouts. The tension was unbearable. Each testimony felt like pulling open an old wound. Survivors described the flames, the screams, the crimson moon. Some jurors reportedly wept. Others looked away, unable to face the horror. Yet beneath it all lurked a deeper question. Was this trial about the massacre, or about centuries of mountain vengeance no law could ever truly tame? In the end, the jury returned its verdict. Valentine Uncle Wall Hatfield and several of his men were found guilty of murder. One, Ellison Cottontop Mounts, a mentally unstable Hatfield relative, was sentenced to hang. His execution would be public, an exclamation point meant to terrify Appalachia into silence. But justice was not clean that day. To the Hatfields, it was a political show trial, proof that courts could be twisted by McCoy influence. To the McCoys, it was barely enough, a single drop of law in an ocean of blood. The feud had entered the courtroom, but even within the walls of justice, the ghosts of vengeance refused to be chained. The so-called trial of the century wasn't closure. It was a spectacle, and as the gavel struck, the people of Appalachia knew the feud wasn't over, not yet. On a cold February morning in 1890, the people of Pikeville gathered in eerie silence. It was no ordinary day. Crowds flooded into town, not just from Kentucky but from across state lines, drawn by a single chilling promise, a public hanging. The condemned was Ellison Cottontop Mounts, a Hatfield by blood but hardly a warrior. Born with albinism, frail in body and fragile in mind, Cottontop had never been a leader. Yet here he stood, marked for death, selected not for his power but because someone had to pay. The gallows loomed in the town square, stark against the winter sky. The wood creaked as the noose swung gently in the wind, as if it, too, hungered for justice. Vendors sold peanuts and cider. Children clambered onto rooftops for a better view. This was not just an execution, it was theater. And deep inside, everyone knew Cottontop was a scapegoat, a symbol sacrificed so the nation could say, "The feud has ended." As guards led him forward, whispers rippled through the crowd. His pale hair glowed like silver in the sunlight, earning him his cruel nickname. His lips trembled, but his voice, thin, almost childlike, cut through the winter air. "The Hatfields made me do it. The Hatfields made me do it," he cried. Was it a confession, a delusion, or the final truth of a broken mind manipulated by his kin? No one knew. Randolph McCoy stood near the front, his face carved with grief and bitterness. To him, this was justice at last, a token repayment for children burned alive under the crimson moon. But even McCoy's eyes betrayed something darker. This was not enough. No rope, no verdict could bring his family back. The sheriff adjusted the knot, his hands steady but his jaw tight. Cottontop was offered a chance for final words. He turned toward the crowd, eyes wide with terror yet strangely calm, and whispered, "They should have hung the others, not me. Lord, have mercy." The trapdoor fell. The crack of the rope echoed through the valley like a rifle shot. Gasps rose, then silence. The crowd watched as his body swayed, the ultimate punctuation mark to decades of blood and fire. Some cheered, some wept, but most just stared, unsure if they had witnessed justice or merely another killing in a cycle that refused to die. For years, Appalachia would remember the image of cotton tops swinging in the wind. To the McCoys, it was proof that vengeance could find its way through the courts. To the Hatfields, it was martyrdom, evidence that their enemies had twisted the law into murder. To the nation, it was the spectacle that closed the book on America's most infamous feud. But beneath the silence of the gallows, the hills still whispered. The blood debt had not been erased. The ghosts of the Tug Fork were not gone. They never would be. The rope had snapped shut on cotton-top mounts, but in Appalachia, silence did not mean peace. For the first time in over a decade, the Tug Fork Valley lay quiet. No gunshots at midnight, no barns set ablaze, no families ambushed on back roads. But the feud had burned more than houses. It had carved scars into the very soul of West Virginia and Kentucky. Generations would grow up in its shadow. Children who once hid beneath floorboards during midnight raids now flinched at the crack of firewood, mistaking it for gunfire. Widows walked the ridges in black shawls, their eyes hollow, their grief woven into the hills like fog that refused to lift. The Hatfields and McCoys had shed so much blood that even the soil seemed cursed, and whispers spread that no crop planted on feud land would ever truly thrive again. The newspapers declared victory, justice served, feud over. But in the hollows, people knew the truth. There was no clean ending. Families carried grudges in silence, passing down tales of betrayal and vengeance like heirlooms. A McCoy child was warned never to cross paths with a Hatfield. A Hatfield youth was taught to carry his family's shame like a second skin. It was a quiet war now, buried beneath layers of pride and paranoia. Yet something larger was stirring. The feud had turned Appalachia into a national spectacle. To city folk in New York and Chicago, the Hatfields and McCoys became grotesque caricatures. Hillbillies locked in endless violence, a primitive people unfit for modern progress. That image would haunt the region for decades, shaping stereotypes still whispered today. The feud wasn't just a family tragedy. It was Appalachia's branding, stamped in blood. Psychologically, the feud rewrote the way locals trusted one another. Every handshake was shadowed by suspicion, every alliance tested by memory. Entire communities fractured. Church pews were divided, schools segregated by bloodline. The mountains themselves seemed to take sides, one ridge carrying the Hatfield name, the next McCoy. Survival here was no longer about land or livestock. It was about reputation, pride, and never being the first to forgive. But the deeper tragedy was what both families had lost, their humanity. What began as a boundary dispute, then a soldier's killing, had spiraled into a generational curse. Both clans had started with ambitions of prosperity and honor. By the end, they were remembered not for the lives they built, but for the lives they destroyed. Modern dynasties are no different. Corporate empires, political families, even celebrities, each risks collapsing into scandal when pride outweighs reason. The Hatfields and McCoys remind us that unchecked vengeance doesn't just kill enemies. It poisons bloodlines, destroys legacies, and leaves behind only ghosts. The hills may have gone quiet, but Appalachia would never be the same again. If the bullets and flames of the Tug Fork feud hadn't burned the Hatfields and McCoys into history, the newspapers surely did. By the late 1880s, America was obsessed. Big city editors, hungry for blood-soaked stories that sold papers, seized on the feud like vultures. Headlines screamed across front pages, "Murder in the mountains." Savage clans spill blood again. Every detail was exaggerated, every rumor twisted, until the feud was less history and more theater. Reporters painted Appalachia as a dark, backward wilderness, lawless hills crawling with hillbillies who settled disputes not with reason but with rifles. The Hatfields and McCoys were cast as caricatures, the ruthless, cunning Hatfields versus the noble, long-suffering McCoys. Truth didn't matter. What mattered was spectacle, and the feud gave the public exactly what they craved: horror, suspense, and the thrill of imagining themselves far from the safety of their cities. The media's sensationalism turned private grief into national entertainment. When the McCoy cabin was burned, illustrations in Harper's Weekly showed women screaming in flames, their faces twisted in agony. When Cotton-Top Mount swung from the gallows, papers described his pale hair glinting like a ghost under the noose. These weren't just reports. They were scripts, written to shock and haunt, to sell millions of copies. And it worked. Across America, families read the feud like a serialized novel. Dinner tables in Boston buzzed with talk of mountain justice. Bars in Chicago debated which clan was truly in the right. Children in New York staged backyard Hatfield versus McCoy games, mimicking gunfights they'd only seen in newspaper sketches. The feud became more than history, it became myth. But here lies the danger. Myth blurred the truth. Reporters rarely mentioned the economic struggles, the coal speculators exploiting Appalachia, or the Civil War wounds that fueled mistrust. Instead, they reduced the conflict to primitive savagery, branding the entire region as violent and uneducated. That stereotype has clung to Appalachia for over a century, warping how outsiders view its people. Psychologically, the families themselves were trapped by these narratives. Once newspapers painted them as eternal enemies, how could they ever stop fighting without appearing weak? Every ceasefire felt like betrayal. Every peace attempt collapsed under the weight of public expectation. The feud, in a sense, was kept alive not by bullets, but by ink. Modern parallels are chilling. Today's media thrives on the same formula, sensationalizing scandal, amplifying division, turning private pain into public theater. The Hatfield-McCoy feud was an early blueprint for how tragedy can be spun into profit, how real families can be sacrificed on the altar of public fascination. In the end, the feud became immortal not because of its blood, but because the press bottled that blood into legend. And once legend takes hold, it never truly dies. For decades after Cotton-Top swung from the gallows, the feud still smoldered like an ember buried in coal dust. The Hatfields and McCoys might have stopped firing rifles across the Tug Fork, but they carried their bitterness like a second skin. Every glance across the river was loaded with suspicion. Every business deal risked collapse if a Hatfield or McCoy name appeared on the contract. Even church congregations split into factions, each pew silently divided by bloodline. Yet time has a way of wearing down even the sharpest blade. By the early 1900s, younger generations began to ask a dangerous question. What did all this bloodshed gain us? They had grown up hearing the legends, the betrayals, the burning cabins, but they were also tired of living in the shadows of graves. Many of them had never even known the original spark of the feud. All they inherited were scars. The coal industry was booming in Appalachia, and survival demanded cooperation. Families that once swore eternal vengeance now found themselves working side by side in mines, their sweat mingling in the black dust. Poverty was the new enemy, and rifles could not kill hunger. Slowly, grudges gave way to necessity. Survival required peace. Still, reconciliation was not easy. Both sides carried wounds too deep for easy forgiveness. A Hatfield might extend a handshake, but a McCoy would hesitate, haunted by memories of burned homes. A McCoy might offer a business partnership, but a Hatfield would wonder if betrayal lurked behind the smile. Forgiveness was fragile, tested daily by pride. The turning point came not in the hollows, but on the stage of history itself. As the feud became legend, told in newspapers, books, and later in Hollywood films, families realized they had been reduced to caricatures. They were no longer just men and women of Appalachia. They were the feud, and that myth would outlive them unless they rewrote the ending. By the mid-20th century, descendants began to hold joint reunions. For the first time, Hatfields and McCoys ate meals at the same table, their laughter replacing old curses. In 1976, they shook hands during a nationally broadcast event, symbolizing that the feud which had defined Appalachia for nearly a century was finally, officially over. Psychologically, this was liberation. For generations, identity had been tied to vengeance. Now, identity could be tied to something else, heritage, survival, even pride in overcoming the past. Both families found power not in killing but in telling their story. And in a way, that was the ultimate victory, transforming a curse into a cautionary tale. Modern dynasties face the same choice. Do they cling to feuds that destroy from within, or do they break the cycle before history reduces them to tragedy? The Hatfields and McCoys chose peace, late but not too late. And in that choice, Appalachia finally began to heal. The rifles had gone silent, the blood feud buried beneath coal dust and gravestones. But the Hatfields and McCoys were far from forgotten. If anything, their war found a second life, not in the hollows of Appalachia, but on the glowing screens of Hollywood, in cartoons, and even in comedy sketches. What had once been a brutal family tragedy was reborn as entertainment. By the mid-20th century, the feud had become shorthand for mindless bickering. A Looney Tunes episode might show two cartoon hillbillies blasting shotguns at each other for laughs. TV sitcoms used the phrase, like the Hatfields and McCoys, to describe squabbling neighbors or feuding families. The nuance, the Civil War wounds, the economic desperation, the grief, was erased. What remained was a caricature, toothless men in overalls, snarling across a fence line with rifles and moonshine. Hollywood, too, seized the legend. Films dramatized the feud as a romanticized Western, filled with larger-than-life gunmen and melodramatic vendettas. The real horrors, the McCoy children burned alive, the psychological torment of decades of blood, were softened or exaggerated to fit a storyline. America consumed the feud not as history, but as spectacle. This pop culture rebirth did two things. First, it immortalized the feud in a way no courtroom verdict ever could. Generations who had never read a history book still knew the names Hatfield and McCoy. The feud became a cultural meme, shorthand for eternal conflict. Second, it trivialized the suffering. Real people had lived and died in agony, but in the public imagination, they were reduced to punchlines. Appalachia itself was branded with the stereotype of violence and backwardness. Its real struggles, poverty, exploitation by coal barons, cultural richness, ignored. And yet, in a strange twist, this distortion also gave the families power. By the late 20th century, Hatfield and McCoy descendants leaned into the legend. They hosted tourist events, staged mock battles, and even starred in reality shows. The very myth that had once humiliated them became a source of income, heritage pride, and cultural identity. The feud was no longer just a ghost, it was a brand. Psychologically, this pop culture rebirth reveals a universal truth. When trauma is too great, societies reshape it into stories they can live with. The feud became entertainment not because people wanted to laugh at tragedy, but because laughing was easier than confronting the abyss of generational hatred. Today, the feud lives on in memes, comedy routines, and TV specials. But beneath the jokes, something darker lingers. The reminder that history's bloodiest wounds can be disguised in laughter, yet never truly erased. The Hatfields and McCoys had become American mythology, half-truth, half-joke, all legend. And once myth takes hold, it belongs not to families but to the world. Even after the last bullet was fired, the Hatfields and McCoys carried the feud inside them like a shadow stitched to their souls. Guns could be laid down, but paranoia is harder to bury. For generations, children of both clans grew up not with bedtime stories of heroes, but with whispered warnings of betrayal, ambush, and fire. Trauma became inheritance, passed down as faithfully as land or family names. Psychologists today would call it generational trauma, the idea that wounds don't just scar individuals but seep into the very psyche of families, shaping behavior long after the event. A McCoy child might be scolded, "Don't trust a Hatfield." A Hatfield boy might hear, "A McCoy will never forgive you." These weren't just lessons, they were chains, binding the future to the sins of the past. The paranoia ran deep. Imagine walking into town, unsure if a handshake hit a knife. Imagine marrying into another family and wondering if whispers behind your back were about your bloodline. Even decades later in schools and churches, the Hatfield-McCoy divide could be felt in invisible walls, pews avoided, friendships stunted, alliances questioned. Trust was a luxury neither side could afford. The psychological toll went further. Constant vigilance had wired these families for survival in a war that had technically ended. Anxiety became normal. Dreams were haunted by flames and rifle shots. Silence at night wasn't peace, it was the pause before another ambush. Such thinking corrodes the mind. It eats away at joy, warps pride into obsession, and turns forgiveness into betrayal. Ironically, the feud also created identity. To be a Hatfield or a McCoy was to be someone, even if that someone was defined by vengeance. Pride in survival mixed with shame of bloodshed, creating a fractured sense of self. Some descendants clung to the feud as heritage, while others tried to escape it, moving far from Appalachia in search of lives unmarked by the curse of their names. Modern parallels are chilling. Corporations at war, political dynasties locked in rivalries, even communities divided by religion or race, all carry echoes of Hatfields versus McCoys. When conflict becomes identity, ending it feels like death. And so, the cycle continues, generation after generation. The legacy of the feud wasn't just blood on the ground. It was a mindset, paranoia, pride, and pain woven into DNA. And though the rifles grew rusty, the ghosts of vengeance whispered on, shaping choices long after the feud itself was history. Because sometimes the hardest battlefield to leave is the one inside the mind. The Hatfields and McCoys may belong to the 19th century, but their feud is anything but ancient history. The battlefield may have shifted from the mountains of Appalachia to corporate boardrooms, political stages, and even the flashing cameras of celebrity culture. But the psychology is the same. Rivalry, pride, and the desperate need to preserve power still drive families and dynasties into modern-day wars. Think of political families locked in endless struggles for dominance, each election framed not just as a contest of ideas, but as a continuation of bloodlines and legacies. The Kennedys, the Bushes, the Clintons, these names evoke loyalty, division, and suspicion. Just as Hatfield and McCoy once did. To win is not only to govern, it is to prove that your family name carries destiny. To lose feels like betrayal, not just to self, but to generations past. Corporate dynasties tell a similar story. The battles between titans like Rockefeller and Carnegie, or today's giants like Bezos and Musk, mirror the same instincts that drove the Hatfields and McCoys: control resources, expand power, and protect pride at all costs. In Appalachia, the fight was over land, timber, and honor. In Silicon Valley, it's over algorithms, influence, and the future of humanity itself. The weapons have changed, but the war drums beat the same rhythm. Even entertainment thrives on this ancient formula. Rivalries between pop stars, athletes, or Hollywood families capture global attention because they reflect a truth we all recognize. Conflict is magnetic. When Taylor Swift feuds with Cannes, or when sports dynasties like the Lakers and Celtics clash, the world watches, transfixed. These spectacles echo the Appalachian feud in miniature. Tribes forming, loyalties tested, and victory demanded at any cost. But the danger remains. Just as the Hatfield-McCoy feud spiraled out of control, modern rivalries risk consuming more than they create. When identity becomes wrapped in conflict, forgiveness looks like weakness. Pride fuels escalation. Every slight becomes another log on the fire. History warns us that unchecked rivalries don't just scar individuals. They fracture nations, divide societies, and sometimes burn the very ground on which they stand. What makes these parallels haunting is that we haven't evolved as much as we'd like to think. Beneath skyscrapers and social media, beneath laws and diplomacy, the old instincts remain. Defend your kin, guard your power, and crush your rival. The Hatfields and McCoys remind us that these impulses, left unrestrained, can stretch a conflict far beyond reason, sometimes for centuries. So when we look at dynasties today, whether in politics, business, or culture, we must ask ourselves, are we watching progress or just a modern replay of an Appalachian nightmare? If you ask most people about the Hatfield-McCoy feud, they'll probably picture two families standing on opposite sides of a hollow, rifles raised, hillbilly stereotypes painted by Hollywood. For decades, the feud has been presented as a kind of comic tragedy. Backwoods folks too stubborn, too ignorant, too wild to let go of an old grudge. Cartoons, movies, and TV sketches have made the name Hatfield and McCoy a punchline. But the truth is far darker, far more human, and far less laughable. The myth is simple: two clans, locked in a ridiculous and overblown rivalry, killing each other over petty insults. It's a caricature, designed for audiences who never set foot in Appalachia, who wanted to believe that the feud was a sideshow of ignorant mountain folk rather than a reflection of universal human flaws. Hollywood leaned into moonshine jugs, fiddle music, and hillbilly banjos, turning real bloodshed into entertainment. But the feud was a product of its time, rooted in economic survival, honor, politics, and the scars of the Civil War. It wasn't just a squabble over a pig or a single romantic betrayal. Those stories, while colorful, were fragments of a much deeper web of causes. Industrialization was creeping into Appalachia, turning land and timber into high-value commodities. Families like the Hatfields and McCoys were fighting not just for pride, but for economic security in a world that was changing faster than they could control. Even the violence itself has been misunderstood. Popular imagination paints it as endless gun battles in the hills, but the killings were sporadic, spread over years, often tied to legal disputes or political contests. The actual death toll, tragic though it was nowhere near the wholesale slaughter that legends suggest. But here's the twist: the smaller the truth, the bigger the myth grew. Why? Because people wanted it. Newspapers exaggerated events to sell copies. Urban Americans consumed the story as evidence of wild Appalachia. And over time, the feud transformed into folklore. The families themselves were never cartoons. They were intelligent, proud, and deeply tied to their land. They weren't buffoons stumbling through violence. They were products of a brutal environment where law was weak, honor was currency, and betrayal demanded a price. Reducing them to stereotypes stripped the humanity out of the story and turned tragedy into comedy. What's most unsettling is how this distortion reflects on us. We prefer the myth because it's easier to laugh at hillbillies than to confront the truth, that pride, violence, and greed are not just Appalachian problems. They are human problems. By mocking the Hatfields and McCoys, society conveniently ignores that similar feuds play out everywhere, on Wall Street, in Congress, and even in family homes. The myth comforts us. The reality unsettles us. But the reality, in all its complexity, is the only version worth remembering. By the early 20th century, the Hatfield-McCoy feud had escaped the hills of West Virginia and Kentucky. It was no longer just a bloody family conflict. It had become folklore, a story passed from one generation to the next, reshaped with every retelling until it was less history and more myth. And like all great folklore, it revealed more about the society telling the story than the people it was supposedly about. America loved the feud because it fit perfectly into the nation's hunger for legends. The story contained all the ingredients: betrayal, forbidden love, political tension, revenge, and bloodshed. It was Shakespeare in the Appalachian Mountains, and newspapers of the late 1800s understood this better than anyone. They sensationalized every gunshot, every betrayal, every courtroom battle, turning the feud into front-page drama for readers who had never seen a coal mine or a mountain hollow. But as the story spread, it also warped. The families became archetypes: the Hatfields, ruthless mountain lords; the McCoys, proud but unlucky victims. Over time, reality was stripped away until only symbols remained. The feud became a shorthand for endless, irrational conflict. Politicians would call their rivals Hatfields and McCoys to mock their stubbornness. Businesses used the name in advertisements to suggest toughness or grit. Even comedy skits turned the feud into slapstick. Hillbillies, with shotguns chasing each other through cornfields. Yet underneath the comedy, the folklore carried a darker truth. Americans recognized themselves in the feud. They saw how greed, pride, and vengeance could consume entire communities. The feud became a mirror for America's own contradictions. On one hand, it was laughed at as proof of rural backwardness. On the other, it was secretly admired, a brutal story of independence, honor, and standing your ground no matter the cost. And here's the eerie twist. Every time America entered a period of conflict, whether political, cultural, or economic, the Hatfield-McCoy feud would resurface in headlines, jokes, or movies. During the Cold War, newspapers compared the U.S. and the Soviet Union to Hatfields and McCoys, locked in endless rivalry. In modern times, pundits use the feud as a metaphor for America's political divisions, where Democrats and Republicans fight with the same kind of generational stubbornness. Folklore has a strange way of immortalizing tragedy, and the Hatfield-McCoy feud is proof. Families died, homes were burned, children grew up in terror, yet their suffering became entertainment for the nation. That's the paradox. Folklore preserves memory, but it also distorts it. What we remember is not the grief of mothers or the fear of children, but the spectacle, the drama, the legend. In the end, the feud became more than a story of two families. It became America's favorite cautionary tale, one that warns us of the dangers of unchecked pride, while also feeding our appetite for blood-soaked legends. And like all great folklore, it refuses to die. The Hatfield-McCoy feud began as a family quarrel in the mountains, but it ended as one of the darkest legends in American memory. Today, more than a century later, its echoes still haunt us, not just as a piece of Appalachian history, but as a mirror reflecting the most destructive parts of human nature. When we strip away the folklore, the gunfire, and the moonshine myths, what's left is a cautionary tale about the power of pride, revenge, and mistrust. The Hatfields and McCoys were not monsters. They were ordinary people, bound by love of land, loyalty to kin, and the scars of war. But those very bonds became chains. Instead of healing, pride festered. Instead of reconciliation, grudges deepened. And in the end, the families were consumed by a fire they themselves had stoked. Here's the truth no legend tells. No one really wins a feud. Every bullet fired, every house burned, every life stolen in the name of honor only left the families weaker, poorer, and more broken. By the time the feud cooled, there was nothing left to prove, just graves on both sides of the Tug Fork River, silent reminders of a war that never should have been fought. But the legacy doesn't end there. In 2003, descendants of the Hatfields and McCoys signed a formal truce, not because they still fought, but because the feud had become bigger than them, an American symbol of endless division. That moment was more than ceremonial. It was a recognition that the past can only be honored when its lessons are learned. And what are those lessons? That unchecked pride destroys. That vengeance poisons generations. That conflict left to rot becomes myth, and myths once unleashed can live longer than flesh and blood. The Hatfields and McCoys remind us of the danger of letting hate define us. But here's the most chilling twist. We are still living in the shadow of that feud. Look around, political parties locked in endless hostility, communities divided along invisible lines, families torn apart by grudges that last decades. The names have changed, the weapons are different, but the psychology is the same. We're still fighting our own Hatfield-McCoy wars, only now they play out on screens, ballots, and streets. So the question is, will we learn or will we repeat? The feud's true legacy is not in the graves of Appalachia, but in the warning it leaves us. When loyalty becomes blind, when pride outweighs reason, and when hatred is passed like inheritance, tragedy is inevitable. It's easy to mock the Hatfields and McCoys as relics of a backwards past, but the real horror is that their story is our story. Their curse lives on, not in Appalachia, but in us. No feud ever ends with a winner, only survivors. The Hatfields and McCoys aren't history, they're prophecy. Pride kills faster than any bullet.